Hi, everybody. I am back to talk about the next info, which is chapter 9, and this is about weathering, the breakdown of rocks, and the formation of soil. So I'm going to record two videos. This first one is going to be about the weathering components, and then the second part is going to be about soils. That'll be a separate video. So I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see the PowerPoint, and we'll go through and okay. So like I said, this is the content in chapter 9. The first section in chapter 9 is called dirt, the dirt on weathering, then physical weathering, chemical weathering, biological weathering, weathering rates. So those first sections are what this video is about. Okay, so basically sediment is small pieces of mineral material of rock that is created from a process that we call weathering. So weathering breaks down the rock over time as the rock ages to produce these tiny little pieces. So if you think of like a grain of sand that came from what was originally a bigger piece of rock, and it was produced as the rocks aged by weathering. And weathering has kind of two different components, a physical and mechanical weathering component and a chemical weathering component. So the physical or mechanical weathering is the breakdown of rocks because of a force. So like one rock smashes into another rock and it breaks a little piece off. That's physical or mechanical weathering. Then chemical weathering is there's a chemical reaction that's going on a more microscopic level along the surface of the rock. So maybe some rainwater is coming in contact with the surface of the rock, and that water molecule itself or something else that's dissolved in the water molecule, some sort of acid compound, is actually having a reaction with the mineral and the different chemical bonds that are in the mineral to break it down on that more microscopic level. So that's by chemical reactions. So if you want to imagine how this weathering process could work, here's a diagram that shows you a rock, and we already know that rocks are made up of different minerals. So in this case, this is maybe something like granite that has some quartz pieces in it. Then it has some feldspar crystals and some biotite crystals. And over time, pressure from wind, from rain, from other rocks, from animals, from plant roots, from chemical reactions with the air, with the oxygen, with the water, with acids, kind of break down this rock over time and kind of disassemble it, and then it can be susceptible to being moved away, transported by erosion once it's kind of broken down. So that's what the last image is showing. So to kind of imagine this in a little bit more detail, first of all, let's think about mechanical weathering. So this kind of just physical, either breaking apart or pulling apart of the different components of rocks. So first of all, there's a term that's called jointing, and jointing is kind of just the natural break apart of rocks that they experience over time. So there's not necessarily like an external force like another rock or a waterfall or an ice sheet that's smashing or breaking the rock, but just as the rock finds itself on the Earth's surface in probably a slightly different physical environment than where it formed. So maybe it's a whole lot cooler at the Earth's surface than where it formed, or maybe it's just under less pressure than where it formed. Then basically that change of pressure, the removal of all what the rocks that used to be sitting on top of it, which are sometimes called the overburden, allows the rock to expand a little bit. And so it can actually crack apart as it expands. And we see this a lot in granite, which we know forms deep underneath the earth in those old magma chambers. So the picture on the right is granite. It's a big granite dome that's kind of cracking apart as it expands because it's now under a much lower pressure from rocks that used to be on top of it. And then on the left, we see a dramatic impact of cooling. So this is basalt, which we know happens from lava flows. The lava flowed out on the landscape, and then as it started to cool, the rock is actually shrinking. And as it's shrinking, it's cracking apart along some weak places in the chemical physical structure, and it breaks into these characteristic columns. So in both these cases, these are examples of mechanical weathering. It's not a chemical reaction. It's a physical breaking apart of the rock, but it's kind of because of a difference in the temperature and pressure that it's experiencing at the Earth's surface relative to where it was formed. And that is called jointing. So those big cracks can be called joints. But there are also lots of external factors that might lead to the breaking apart of rocks. And a lot of times this happens when some sort of external force kind of acts as a wedge. So there might be a very tiny crack in a rock, and then something gets inside that crack and wedges it apart to make it bigger and bigger, and then break pieces of the rock apart over time. So this could be frost, like water could flow down into a crack in the rock, and then if that water froze, the water would expand. It could crack the rock apart, just like if you've ever put a bottle in the freezer and then come back to find that it has shattered in the freezer. Salt can do this too. If there's salt dissolved in the water, it can flow into a rock, and then the salt can start to crystallize, and as it expands, it can act as a wedge. And then, of course, plant roots can be very powerful wedges. Here's some pictures along the bottom showing plant roots kind of growing in amongst the rocks, pushing the rocks apart. And over time, as the plant roots get bigger and bigger, what used to be very small and could get into a little plant root can really do some amazing work. So here's roots in a natural setting, and then roots growing over some temples in a place in Cambodia called Angkor Wat that you might have seen before, pictures of before. And so roots can do a lot of work to mechanically break apart rocks. And then, of course, rocks just smashing into each other can break apart rocks. And so there's lots of just physical forces that weather rocks over time. There's also lots of chemical forces that can break down rock over time. So different kinds of chemical reactions happen as the rock interacts with water, with oxygen, or with other kinds of things that might be dissolved in water or found in the environment. So the first kind of set of chemical reactions are called dissolution. And basically this just means that literally the rock can dissolve into the water, just like you've probably seen salts or sugars dissolve in water. And so the minerals literally dissolve into water, and they can eat away the rock over time by this process. So if you've ever been inside a limestone cave, like I have pictured up at the top, this is created as the water, the groundwater, is dissolving the minerals that used to be forming this cave, the calcium and the carbonate compounds. And so that's a chemical weathering process. Hydrolysis also happens when the minerals literally react with the water. So the water just doesn't surround the minerals. That's what dissolving is. But the water itself breaks apart into its hydrogen and oxygen components and then recombines to make new chemicals in combination with the minerals. And then oxidation is a common reaction where oxygen in the atmosphere reacts with different kinds of minerals. And so this forms a kind of rusty color. So if you see red rocks or red soil, that's probably because different kinds of iron compounds that were originally in rocks have oxidized as they've come in contact with the atmosphere over time. I have this picture I'm noticing of a sinkhole on the slide too. So I just want to mention that is something that is created when we have limestone caves underground, and often they're filled with water, and then maybe because of groundwater pumping from pumping of wells or other natural processes might drain out a limestone cave, and then as the water is removed, the ceiling of the cave is no longer supported and it will fall down into the ground to create these sinkholes. So you might have seen these kind of sci-fi looking pictures in the past, but they're real, they really happen. Okay, anyway, all these are kinds of chemical processes that might break apart water or rocks over time. So one more thing I want to mention is acidity. So there's a lot of acids in the environment, and these can be exuded from plants, different kinds of lichens or other plants growing on the surface of rocks might leave acids behind that can react with the rock. But also rainwater is slightly acid. So even in totally clean, unpolluted environments, the water that falls with the raindrops reacts with carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, and there's always some natural level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as it does that, the carbon dioxide and the water react to make carbonic acid, and then that's H2CO3 you see over here on this equation. You don't need to know that chemical equation, but taking chemistry, that might make sense to you. And then that carbonic acid can dissociate into hydrogen ions and carbonate ions. And those H plus, those hydrogen ions, are really what makes an acid an acid. Those H pluses have a lot of force, a lot of vigor. They go around and they're very reactive with other compounds in the environment, and they can break them apart. And so that's what an acid is. So all rainwater is slightly acid. And then as we add more pollutants to the atmosphere, whether that's in extra carbon loading in the atmosphere, more carbon dioxide, or different kinds of nitrogen or sulfur-based gases that might be coming from our tailpipes of our cars, or different kinds of metal smelting or coal burning. As that stuff gets in the atmosphere, it can also react with rainwater to create more acidity. And then we can have sometimes acid rain problems where the rain is kind of toxic and can hurt plants and can hurt people, create health problems for animals and ecosystems, but it can also eat away at rocks. And so we have kind of on the left here a picture of a natural chemical weathering happening on the landscape. And then on the right, this is a picture of a gargoyle in Europe that used to have a lot more features, but as the acid rain has come down and hit the face of this gargoyle over time, chemical weathering has eaten away at the face of this particular rock. So that's another example of chemical weathering in action. So it's important to understand that both chemical and physical or mechanical weathering are important, but they don't happen in isolation. They happen together, and they have what is called a synergistic effect on one another. So when something has a synergistic impact, or synergy more generally, it refers to when something happens where when two factors come together, they create something that's more than a sum of their parts. Okay, so for example, say I was trying to move a heavy table. I came along and I tried to move it myself, and I spent 5 minutes trying to move it myself, and then I gave up. I couldn't move it really at all. Then I asked my husband, hey, can you help me? Can you move this table? I can't seem to move it. He comes over and he is able to drag it a few feet after working for about 5 minutes. Okay, so we've both put in 5 minutes of our effort trying to move this table, and it's moved about 5 feet. Instead, if we had both spent 5 minutes working at the same time, and we had both together tried to lift the table, we may have, over that 5 minutes, been able to put all that energy to moving the table 10 feet or 20 feet, right? This is what cooperation is all about, right? You can do more when you work together. And so that would be a synergistic effect, but synergy happens around us in nature all the time when different kinds of phenomena are happening together. And as a result, they sort of add up to big impact. So physical and chemical weathering are happening never in isolation, always going hand in hand. Physical weathering is basically breaking apart rock, so exposing more surface area of rock, increasing the surface area to volume ratio. So then there's more area that oxygen or water can react with, and that allows the chemical reactions then to happen faster. And then on the other hand, the chemical weathering, the chemical reactions are maybe weakening the rock a little bit. And so then it might be more susceptible to being broken by roots or frost or just regular jointing. And so they're kind of working together, cooperating all the time to, over geologic time, have huge impacts in the ability to break apart rocks. And what might seem on a day-to-day or hour-to-hour basis when you're observing very small changes that you might not imagine they could add up to such big impacts. So not all rocks weather at the same rate. Some rocks are just harder, they're more resistant, and that a lot has to do with the minerals that make up those rocks. Some are just more easily broken down in the presence of water or oxygen or wind or rain. Also, the climate that a particular rock is existing in may have a big impact on how quickly it breaks down. So basically what we see on the landscape when we look behind is that some pieces of rock are more rigid, they're more resistant, and then some pieces are kind of softer, more susceptible to weathering. And so we can kind of see that we sometimes have these interesting geologic features where resistant pieces are left behind and susceptible pieces have been eaten away. So in this case, these are these hoodoo formations that there's a lot of these in the Southwest where there was all these geologic layers with sandstone and shale. Shale is softer, is eaten away more quickly. Sandstone is more rigid. So we get these interesting features where we have sandstone left behind and shale weathered away below. So this would be an example of a differential weathering process. Again, things like quartz are very resistant. Things that are hard are very resistant. Rocks that naturally have a lot of joints, things like basalt, or rocks that are regularly layered. So we talked about foliation in terms of metamorphic rocks, things like shale or slate have that kind of natural layering in them. Those kinds of things make them more susceptible because like water and air can kind of get into those layers and then start to break apart the rock more easily. So again, the rock property itself might have an impact on differential weathering, and then climate. Warmer climates usually have breakdown that happens more quickly than colder climates. However, the presence of water usually breaks things down, and ice breaks things down faster. So a warm, dry climate might actually break down faster than a slightly colder climate if there's a lot of water, a lot of ice there. So we have a lot of different factors to consider, but the impact is that not all rocks are breaking down at the same time, which makes these interesting landscape features for us to look at. So we looked at one feature already. Another impact that we can see of this that I think we mentioned in the context of sedimentary rocks is when we go to the beach and we look down at the sand at the beach, usually we have a lot of light sand, okay? And so this light sand is usually a lot of quartz and a lot of feldspar. And these are the minerals that make up a lot of granite, which is one of the hardest rocks that we have. And also quartz and feldspar themselves are some of the hardest minerals. And then the other minerals that maybe were originally in quartz or might have been in other rocks that were found in the watershed above the beach are probably things that were more susceptible to weathering. They've been broken down into fine pieces of silt and clay and washed out into the ocean or blown away by the wind. And so there's not very many of them left. And mostly what we have left at the beach are these really resistant minerals from more resistant rock types. If we do have an area where we have unusual sands, it's usually because the watershed is small and has a very specific geology. So there's not a lot of different kinds of rocks or minerals there. So if we go to like Hawaii and see red sand or black sand beaches, that's usually because all the rocks in the whole watershed above that beach are some sort of basalt or iron-rich basalt that would make it dark or red in color. And then a student a couple semesters ago was asking me about this interesting beach in California in Julia Pfeiffer State Park, which is down in the Big Sur on the Central Coast. And I had not been there, but I looked it up, and basically they have this purple sand on the beach that's created from these little garnets, these purplish colored garnets that are in these kind of metamorphic rocks that exist along that particular watershed. So maybe you'll go visit there someday. Okay, so basically that's weathering. That's how we get these different sediments that might end up combining to form sedimentary rocks over time, or might end up combining to form soil. But I'm going to stop here to give you a break and then talk about soil in a separate video.